If you told me a week ago what I'm going to write now, I would have laughed at you. On May 25th, I realised absolute truth. During the week that passed, I had a 6.5 day solo retreat and with some intense 10 to 12 hours of daily practice. The weekend before, May 18th to the 20th, I went on a nice camping trip with 3 of my friends and fellow self-actualizers. We did some inner and regular self-actualization work together and enjoyed time in nature. This was a great preparation and helped me to put some space between practical everyday life and the retreat. My intent was to reconnect myself with spirituality and to go deep into the work. I combined several different practices: Kriya Yoga, labelling and do-nothing meditation, holotropic breathing, and a walking meditation starting at 5 AM in the morning. On the 4th day I took 300 micrograms of AL-LAD. I tried to time everything in a way that I was at least likely to get disturbed by my housemates. Here's my schedule. M equals meditation. SDS equals strong determination sitting. SHF equals see, hear, feel, labelling. Holo equals holotropic breathing. Although I was able to follow through with the entire schedule without missing one single practice, which I am kinda proud of, I ended up having a lot of what I would call half-assed sits and sloppy meditations. I had to move and open my eyes a lot, even during strong determination sitting, and I ended up getting lost in thoughts a lot. Nevertheless, I was able to enter a state of great calmness by Wednesday. I also did 1 hour of walking meditation 3 times a day, just walking around in a park next to where I live, so I wasn't really that isolated from the rest of humanity, although I didn't really speak to anybody. In case you might be wondering, I had psychedelic trips before this one. I was actually doing psychedelics before I stumbled about Leo and the concept of personal development. And over the last 5 years I had a couple of mushroom and salvia trips, 125 IM bomb experience, and 3 AL-LAD trips prior to this one, at a range of 100, 200 and 150 micrograms. Here's what I experienced. The actual retreat and practice itself was rather ordinary. I had to go through some emotional work and purging to enter a state of great calmness and equanimity on day 3. To cultivate this internal peace helped a great deal with preparing me for day 5. The holotropic breathing also did a lot. I typically fall asleep soon after the breathing is over after a state of trance where most of the purging seems to happen for me. After waking up I always feel so relieved. On the 5th day I prepared everything for the actual trip. I sat down and said to myself, I'm ready to learn. Whatever may come, I'm open and will accept it. Then I orally administered the 300 micrograms of AL-LAD and listened to some music for about 35 minutes to help myself relax a little from a mild pre-trip anxiety. As I noticed it starting to take effect, I turned off the music and laid down on my bed. I started to see visual phenomenon and allowed myself to get fascinated by the patterns of the ceiling above me. I just let myself ooze into them and start to get absorbed. Everything got more and more intense, and suddenly everything, my whole visual field, but also the inner world of mind and the fields of sound and touch, collapsed into one giant mosaic-like totality. And then, I suddenly realised what happened. I was no longer there. There was just infinite formlessness. I became truth. I should know that the experience was profoundly beautiful and profoundly shocking at the same time. My human body just contorted in awe and horror. I felt every single emotion at the same time. I also noticed that I started to hear sounds. High ringing type of sounds that augmented the chirping of the birds outside, and low drone-like sounds that seemed to be related to my breath. Now the really profound thing was that I seemed to be able to switch back and forth between this state of being absolute formless infinity and the state of being contracted human form. This was immense. I experienced how I, absolute infinity, contract to create form, mind, relative reality, ego, and suffering. I realised that I am God and how I am constantly creating everything. I realised that what most people call hallucinations or visuals on psychedelics are actually artifacts of how creation of form from formlessness happens. They are just how absolute nothingness looks like when it creates reality. The switching back and forth produced innumerous insight, and I was able to learn so much. It went on about 4 to 5 hours, and then I started to stay more and more in the domain of forms. As the trip became milder and tapered off, I decided to take a long ass walk because I wanted to be outside and in nature. It was so beautiful. My mind still was in this hyper-intelligent mode that it seems to enter on AL-LAD, and started to produce insight after insight, and it integrated all the theory and concepts about non-duality with the experience. The trip was about 8 to 9 hours long, and I entered a nice afterglow. This lasted the whole day, as I continued my retreat. I returned back to the state of great calmness. I had the days before the trip, and the experience became more and more of a memory. I started to realise that this glimpse won't be permanent, but the insights stayed with me. Here's what I learned. I became truth. I experienced what I truly am. Everything is in perspective now. I learned how creation and existence work. I understood how I, the big I, nothingness, God, infinity, formlessness, contract to spit out all dualistic forms, including my own human form, the mind, and reality. I also realised how I have to create suffering and ego in order for this to happen. This was a profoundly powerful and eye-opening insight. It also showed me how I, my human form, can literally not exist and be happy at the same time. For my body even to take a single breath, I have to create form, and therefore suffering. And it made this whole issue of having to physically die to get enlightened very clear. Letting go completely and literally is the way that I can return to nothingness. There can only be truth, or there can be creation and suffering. I understood every single contemplative practice, how each one works, and in what way it is supposed to reveal truth to you. Kriya, breathing, and all the different meditation techniques Leo and Shinzen talk about make total sense now. I also learned how to meditate intuitively. The way infinity came to me and the way I had to let go sort of made a permanent imprint, and was able to recreate the way I focused my mind and surrendered myself on the next day. It's basically a combination of open, choiceless awareness and a very deep surrender, similar to the do nothing technique. Leo's guided meditation video actually gets pretty close to it. Although I am not able to recreate the deep state I had on my trip, I can archive a calm and extremely peaceful no-mind kind of state that way. I learned how life purpose and spirituality work together. This became so clear to me by becoming infinity and seeing how reality comes into existence. Maintaining a minimal sense of self for this mammal that I am to survive is best done by aligning myself more and more with the truth and with living an integrated, purposeful life. I learnt how the whole issue of authenticity and relating to other people is connected with spirituality. This was a huge insight. The only way to relate to other beings without creating suffering is the way of utter vulnerability. Like if you literally would lay yourself your naked body in the arms of another person, exhale your last breath and say, "You can have everything. My entire existence. It's yours." This kind of surrender is the exact same surrender that is needed for enlightenment. I learned that the biggest trap I can now fall into is to cling to the memory of my awakening too much and to have too strong of a desire to recreate it. Whenever I am clinging to the memory, I am not surrendering to the truth. So here's what's next for me. More practice and more tripping. This experience of infinity I had is already fading, and I see how I have to do a lot more work to make it penetrate the core of my being more. I want to take my spiritual practice way more seriously, and I want to embody what I have learned. More theory. Even though I have studied quite a lot, I now feel like I needed the experience to truly understand any of the theory. There is so much more to learn now. More life purpose work. I am currently building a life around being a musician, and I want to do it in the way that is as aligned to truth as possible. Having seen Infinity made it incredibly clear to me how this is going to happen. Doing more for my body. I have seen what incredible miracle it is to have the form of a human being, and I want to take care of this mammal that I am as best as I can. And although I have a pretty clean diet, I have all sorts of tense muscles in my back and consume quite a lot of caffeine. Getting more into fitness and exercising is inevitable right now. And finally, working on truthful and authentic relations to others. I want to be able to open myself to others way more and to become a lot more honest. So here's some tips and advice I have. Unlike Leo, I would advise you to have your first experience of truth with AL-LAD rather than 5-MeO-DMT. I understand that this is sort of personal, but if I would take the 20 minutes of my trip that were most intense and imagine myself getting blasted into this state within a few seconds, I wouldn't have been able to let go so smoothly, and I guess I wouldn't have nearly learned as much. Think of it this way: if you are trying to understand light, and you can choose between a light bulb, which is nicely dimmed on and off again, and a single bolt of lightning, I guess for a first timer, the light bulb is much more helpful. Probably my most important advice: study the theory. If I wouldn't have been studying the theory of non-duality for the last couple of years, I would literally have gotten nothing out of the experience. My mind wouldn't have been able to make sense out of anything. It would just have been some hallucination for me. Having concepts of what I was experiencing helped a great deal with recognising its absolute truth, and the way that AL-LAD makes your mind become this hyper-intelligent wisdom machine worked greatly with that, which is another reason why I would recommend AL-LAD over 5-MeO for a first time experience. On retreat, practice starts to take on a different dynamic on its own. Stuff comes up and it might be getting very hard to do some of the techniques as good as you would be able to do them in your daily practice. Don't judge yourself for that, and don't judge your performance. Surrender to whatever happens and try not to get frustrated. The retreat is at play here, and it will give you whatever you need to learn right now, sort of like a trip. Thinking in terms of good or bad retreats is not useful, precisely like thinking in terms of good or bad trips is not useful. Solo retreats are perfect settings for breakthrough doses of psychedelics. If you are serious about experiencing truth for the first time, then this is definitely one of the most recommended alternatives. If you're struggling with this issue of life purpose versus spirituality, consider psychedelics. For me, they made the solution to this incredibly clear. They actually showed me that there is no real difference between the two, especially if you understand how your core values relate to the truth. Lastly, remember that letting go is the key. I am so grateful right now. Awakening is so powerfully life-transforming and liberating. Thank you all for walking this path together. I hope this report is helpful. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.